So it's been a little bit over a year now since I started landscape photography, and I wanted to go over the photos that I've taken to kind of see how my landscape photography has progressed and talk to you about what are the biggest changes I see in my photography, what I was doing then, the mistakes I was kind of making, and how I like to think about my progression as well. So without anything else, let's just get right into it. I think at the very beginning, I was just looking at things that really stood out to me or captured my attention. So for example, this little hut here, the colors were really nice. There's nothing really fancy going on with the composition. I thought it was just very clean, simple composition. I actually ended up never posting this photo anywhere. But at the very beginning, it was really about just things that caught my eye. And I didn't necessarily know how to put that in the frame, but I would just try and take a picture of it. So here I caught these two deer in between these two branches. But the problem with this photo is it's really just very grainy. I didn't know what shutter speeds to work with. I didn't know how to quickly switch my camera from taking it off a tripod and using it handheld to be able to capture the movement in wild animals and things like that. And I think that kind of messed me up a little bit here. It took me probably several shots to even get the deer in focus properly because there were a lot of branches in the way, and now I'm able to do that a lot better, but I didn't really know how my camera worked. And so at this stage, I'm still trying to figure out how my camera works and the nuances of switching different settings quickly in the field. And through all of that, we see a lot more of these types of photos where I see something beautiful and I try to figure out how to take that photo. So for this moon, for example, I saw this beautiful full moon for the first time since I picked up a camera, and it was incredibly large, incredibly vibrant, and I had just come off of a 2-hour photography hike, and I spent another 2 hours just trying to capture this moon. Again, nothing going out in the foreground. I couldn't be bothered with it at that time either. I didn't really think it mattered that much. I think at that point I was just so enamored by the moon that I really wanted to capture it. And you can see that the editing didn't go really well either because I wanted to capture the details in the moon, but I also wanted to capture that glow, and the aperture was kind of messing me up a little bit. And so I tried to superimpose the detailed moon on top of the glowy moon, and you can see that on the edges it's not as clean as it could have been. It looks more like an eclipse if anything. And then following that, just spending time going out there during golden hour and taking photos of things that I think look pretty, but don't know if they're going to end up being a photo that I actually enjoy. I probably just wanted to take a photo for the sake of taking a photo with the light involved. And then going off of that, you'll see photos that look like these where I want to use the snow and capture a composition, but the composition needs a lot more work. It's not as clean either. You can see there's a car passing in the back that I completely missed out on when I was taking the photo, and I think this is the first time I actually look at it and I saw something there. And I'm not really worried about any of the light or how complex that composition is. I'm just trying to see what's out there, what's beautiful, or what captures my attention. Or if I see something beautiful, like for example this tree was, try to frame it in an interesting way. Whether or not that framing actually works and whether or not everything else around it is as clean as I would want it to be is another question, but I think at that time that's what I was going for. And then going out a lot more into the town area as well, not just limiting it to the nature. Because I didn't want to limit myself to just nature. I wanted to get better at generally landscapey, urban architecture type of photography as well. And I actually really like this photo taken again during golden hour because that's what I was trying to do. I was trying to optimize that, not really knowing how to use that light well at this point, just knowing that the light does something really beautiful because it turns everything yellow and glowy and it creates these really nice shadows. And so just going with that instead. I didn't really worry about where the light is landing, how much detail I'm getting, what the right settings need to be for the camera even. All I thought about was composition. And even then my concepts were pretty flawed. Like it's leading somewhere, but it kind of just ends over here. There's nothing of interest back here to actually draw the attention, and all I was thinking about was strong foreground, strong leading lines, that's a composition. There were times in between all of this where I did capture some really beautiful photos that I really enjoyed. I really liked this photo, but I thought these trees over here were just too distracting. I tried forever to try and clone them out with poor results. And then I just let it be because I'm like, it's not going to work. Now I actually really enjoy this and I don't think this kind of distracts from the overall photo at all. A lot of times I just ended up getting lucky. Like I didn't line these birds up at all. They just happened to line up and I was taking photos in this general direction and I just cropped it down, I think, even to this. I think when I got lucky and I saw that those photos appealed to me, that's when I thought about why those photos appealed to me more and what made them so different than the other photos I've taken. Because even with the other photos, I thought I was onto something great, but I ended up not liking the photo at all later on. Whereas with these photos, simple, but for some reason they worked so well, even though they had similar compositional tools. And I think that just changed how I understood what those compositional tools were to be used for. And then finally, when I started getting more into a little bit of urban photography, that's when I started realizing the power of light a little bit in photos and how different types of light, not just golden hour light casting on a certain subject would create. So over here in these New York City photos, the play of the light and the clouds and the silhouettes just worked really well together. I really enjoyed it. But again, I was still making a lot of mistakes here. You can see that these photos are pretty grainy. This photo is pretty smooth because I tried to denoise it a little bit, but it's lost a lot of the details. This photo over here is also very grainy. I really love this composition. I think it worked well, but it is, again, too grainy. And I think what I was lacking there was not just the tripod, because with the tripod I wouldn't be able to capture the bird, but a better understanding of how to control noise in my photo. About a month later, you'll see that my composition has started to improve a lot more, and I am taking photos that are a little bit more simplified than just the basic composition that you might end up seeing. But at the same time, I'm not immune to going to those iconic locations, because as beginner photographers, that's what we want to do. We want to go to those iconic locations and capture that photo because we want something that works. At the time, we realized that some of our photos aren't that good, especially when we compare against other photos. But when we see more iconic shots, we want to take those because we want to have at least one photo that we know is known to be good. But at the same time, I wasn't distracted from other compositions that I wanted to see work. I wanted to find original compositions as well. I didn't want to be tied to just whatever was shown in other Instagram images. I wanted to explore and just looking at everything really, and my observability starts to improve a lot more. And so trying to find something interesting and then trying to frame it in an interesting way. And finally, when spring starts to come, I start getting my first taste of fog in Pennsylvania. And that's something I was really looking forward to because we don't really have a lot of mountains. We don't really have a lot of water or oceans. So that means that you have to focus a lot more on forest or woodland photography. And one thing that I kept running across was that people recommending going out there during fog. The first fog that I ever saw, I went out and I thought I loved these images back then. They're still pretty neat, but I know that there's a lot of things missing. So I really like, for example, the dew drops here, the details of the little leaves, but I know that this image could be a lot cleaner and a lot better if I had repositioned myself a little bit. And because at that time I also didn't know how to properly photograph woodlands, I was just trying to include myself as a subject, as an interesting subject in this kind of woodland fog photography scene. I thought that it would make for a more compelling photo. I don't think I was right, but I think I was just also trying to really experiment with adding humans or adding myself into the photo as a focal point for the scene. But even then, my composition wasn't that great. So I would take really simple photos and I think I would really enjoy them. But then at the end of the day, I would also take pretty poor photos when I was put into a more complex scene. This was the first time I was viewing this area. This was the first time that I was viewing such a wide vista as well. And I really didn't know how to work with it well. I didn't know what the type of photos that I wanted to create. I didn't know how to manage my camera either to be able to take photos which didn't really mute out everything. I didn't know what I was doing wrong. And again, I tried to add myself as an interesting subject, but it really doesn't distract from all the poor things in this photo, such as the blue clouds or the blue haze, the oversaturated colors in the back. Again, similarly, trying to use some form of leading lines and interest in the cloud and the rocks, but very poor composition. I think there's nothing really interesting going on here. Even though I was in front of something really beautiful, I just didn't know how to work with it. If you can see, there's some God rays in the back with the clouds and the light just shining through, but again, no idea how to actually work with it. I tried taking photos that were interesting enough with that, but I think I was too focused on having an interesting foreground all the time that I didn't try and focus enough on that specific location, try to find compositions with my telephoto lens instead. So the next couple of months went by where I was just trying to find different locations around my area that would have something interesting which I could photograph. And I would still struggle a lot with compositions then. And I didn't really know how to edit it that well either. I think I was over editing it to kind of distract from the missing elements in the composition. I was kind of confused about the type of photo or the end result that I wanted from the photo. And a lot of it is just taking more photos and ending up with bad photos and realizing that you don't like it before you know what you actually enjoy. And so I started to experiment a lot more with my telephoto lens, taking photos that normally you wouldn't take because there's just no foreground, but some things that actually worked really well because I was deviating from the path a little bit about what a photo needs to look like. And although my composition did start to improve a little bit, I started to simplify the scene a lot more. I think my first big photography trip to Great Smoky Mountains, I still struggled a bit because I saw this amazing fog and I wanted to capture everything. I wanted to capture the depth, and I knew that I would be able to take out some of the details hidden in that in editing as well. But I think I completely lost sight of how to actually compose at the very beginning. I think I was just too excited and I didn't know how to manage that. And especially because I was a relatively new photographer, I didn't know how to think quickly enough to capture the photo that I wanted. But as that time progressed, I did end up creating really nice, simple, clean compositions and started using the light and the layers much more effectively, because in that time I did have a lot more opportunities to take different types of photos as well. And by the end of it, I was really comfortable taking interesting photos of mountains and different lighting conditions with those mountains. Now, that's not to say I became an expert, but there are some photos that I came back with which I still love even to today. But I think that was one of the bigger turning points to my landscape photography, because my composition started to become a lot more cleaner, a lot more simpler, and I was starting to use light also more interestingly. I don't just focus on the foreground, but I do try to capture the entire scene, and I start to pay attention to a lot of the different details as well. I'm starting to pay attention to how the light interacts with the landscape rather than there just being golden light and that making the photo beautiful. And as my compositions improve, I begin to form more of an intuition of the different types of photos and conceptualize the photos as well. So, for example, for this photo, I knew that I needed to use a telescopic lens to make sure that I had perspective compression and use these repeating patterns leading up to a focal point that wasn't there, so I had to go into the photo. And so realizing when I needed to be in the photo, or I wanted a human to be in the photo to act as a focal point, really helped to grow my photography. If you see here, for example, although the bugs here were a fluke, I did conceptualize how I wanted the moon to appear with the plant. Although the image could be a little bit cleaner, this is one of the photos that I was most proud of, because I spent a lot of time trying to conceptualize and understand how to properly frame it, and then being able to technically get detail both in the foreground as well as in the moon, I think was a pretty big achievement for me at that time. Also, at the same time, I started going back to the same locations in my area in different conditions and really trying to understand what type of lighting conditions would work really well. So fog, for example, isn't just tied to woodland, but also have really powerful effect in areas close to the woodland, but on the edge of the woodland, and even in water, for example, especially if they're fishermen. And actually, as I get better and better at compositions, I start going out a little bit less at this time because I feel like I've been to the same location over and over. But I think that was a big problem because the landscape was changing. There was farm fields that were growing, there were sunflowers growing, and I didn't even realize it in the same spots that I had visited before but had just missed because I didn't know what was going to happen there. And so that's one of the things that I learned the most is no matter how much you know about the location, if you go back at a different time, at a different season, you'll see something completely different. Especially if you're a beginner photographer, there's just so much that's going to change because of nature that you really need to keep going back to those places. At that time now, I was pretty confident in my ability to get composition, but there was still a lot of things that I had not explored yet. I hadn't gone to oceans yet to really capture photos close to the ocean. I hadn't done any nighttime photography either because near me there wasn't a lot of stars visible. And so the first time I actually did night photography was on a trip to Acadia, and I ended up being able to capture something beautiful, albeit the foreground wasn't the best. Even with this photo, this was an accident because I had originally sat in front of the camera for a long exposure shot and then moved out of the way, and so the light you see here is from my headlamp, but it ended up working really neatly, and I really like how original this photo is, even though I didn't use something like double exposure. But even then, I was more comfortable coming back with decent photos from the different places of the trip. I knew when not to take a photo, and that's why there's not a lot of bad photos, because I just didn't take those photos. I just didn't take photos when I knew that the lighting was bad or I knew the composition didn't work. And I think that's something that I started to develop a lot later on, where I just stopped taking photos because I knew that that wasn't going to work, and the composition could be better in a different location, or the lighting could be better if I waited. And so on the other trips as well, I realized what compositions would work, what wouldn't work. I would experiment a lot more and wouldn't be afraid to go back to the same location day after day, even on the same trip, if I had the ability to do so, to take photos that I knew would work at a different time or with a different lighting condition. And then finally, when fall came around to Pennsylvania, it was something that I had been waiting for the longest time, because summer in Pennsylvania was green everywhere and I wanted a little bit of color because that was going to be my first fall after I had picked up a camera. So I was really excited to then finally go to this place called Ricketts Glen, which is an amazing park filled with waterfalls. And what I was really surprised by was how many amazing images I came back with. But I think looking back, it doesn't actually surprise me that much because of the fact that I was now decent with composition, but I also knew when not to take a photo. So the photos that I did come back with were photos that I really ended up enjoying, and I can't wait to end up printing them as well. But I think come winter, I was really uninspired by everything that I saw, especially because I wasn't really traveling that much. And I was waiting for snow, and snow didn't really happen that much this winter in the area that I was living, when I did get snow, I would venture out, and it was a different experience trying to take photos in snow when the snow was also trying to cover your camera. But I did end up with really nice compositions in areas very close to my home. So finally, when I started to see a little bit more color, a little bit more atmosphere start to come back because of the mist and because of the rising temperatures, that's when I started to get re-inspired by my local landscapes, and also start going out a lot more, and then trying to re-explore different areas that were close to my home or work that I hadn't really explored before. But I realized that those spots also had a lot more to offer. And now it's been a little bit over a year since I started landscape photography, and I hope you also saw the growth in the types of photos that I take. And I think one of the biggest reasons is just realizing when a scene will translate into a good photo, and if it isn't, what you can pick out of that scene to translate that into a good photo, even if you can't see something very conventional. And I think what also jump-started my landscape photography was just being able to realize that the types of photos that I see on social media or Instagram aren't necessarily the type of photos that I myself will enjoy taking. And I think the photos that I am inspired by aren't necessarily the photos that I'll be able to take in this area. So finding the types of photos that you enjoy, that you can take in your local area, because those are the photos that you can actually take and create almost every day. Those were the photos that really helped ensure that I was happy with the type of landscape photography and with the photos and where my photography was headed. And if you are a beginner landscape photographer, I hope you learned that everyone starts differently, and even with my photos, they were pretty, I guess, subpar at the very beginning, and they are now at a place where I think they're pretty nice. Now, maybe a couple of years down the line, I'll still think that these photos that I think are really good right now aren't that good. But as of now, I think my photography is progressing at a pace that I'm pretty comfortable with. And so I hope you find this helpful. If you have any questions or comments about my progression or what I did specifically, I'll try to address them. And remember to leave a thumbs up and subscribe to this channel. All right, I'll see you next time. Bye.